Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 14th of May. I will scroll through the numbers here. We're looking at the high flyers, and it's interesting because now we're starting to see, after the nice little pop rally, some weakness potentially in some of the daily readings as well as certain intraday. We know that they're already overbought in a lot of cases, so when we take a look at the numbers, we're going to have to be a little more careful going forward here, because what should have been a nice increase in some of the readings from what we saw in price just didn't seem to materialize completely. Look at that. That's a lot of buys for the NASDAQ. Very few sell signals. Still a few of them, though. And so here we go, and we look at it. Now we had a nice straight decline here, 2 days. Boom, and then the start of this day. So you went from the peak here, steel moving down. It could break below the green. That would be the first indication. The fact that the steel, the cyan is below the red, positive for continuation of trend. We've got to keep an eye on that one as far as pivot change, because if the red starts to flatten out going forward here, then we would be looking at some potential trouble signs for at least the S&P, that's the ES. If we look at the NASDAQ, interesting as well, about to meet this key point of crossover between the cyan and green, and if cyan pivots up and green pivots away from here, in this case we still have green moving forward, cyan looks to be going flat, and we have steel moving lower. Now if steel dips below, it's going to be a clear sell signal coming off of what just turned out to be the primary buy, and we can already see it developing here in the YM for the Dow. So steel's already dipped below the green. The advantage you've got is that you also had the crossover of cyan going below, but now pivot up of cyan, and green now leads this because it's now ahead of even the steel. So pivot up from this particular point. We'll be definitely watching for steel below cyan and or a green pivot lower. Going to be an interesting one here, because certainly it can continue. I'm not suggesting that it's time to be terrified or anything like that. It's just one of those points where we really want to be paying attention and not shying away from what the readings are. We knew that we had to see USO here climbing, and it started. We knew that we were looking for the breakout. It opened up higher and immediately was a crossover from that, and we've had the nice continuation. So again, here we'll be looking for any green that dips below, and certainly if cyan can get below red, then we know that you've got a nice run back to the upside before we have to think about a short that will take us back to the overall lows. And gold, again, we saw that the pivot up for what potentially was going to be the start of a buy as we were coming down, but then we had the rejection of cyan moving higher, steel, and it's just when you get those peak moves, when they come closer together and then break away, it's usually the beginning of something turns down. So gold's going to suffer some. That potentially could assist the market in its rise. X, and see again, these are breaking the same direction. We're still having more green movement, which means we've got more buyers. You're still rising in your steel, but you also are seeing an increase in the cyan, and it's not getting a crossover to where there's a capitulation from a short standpoint. So there's no real short covering that's going to propel. This is all going to have to be new buying, and that's why some of the highs aren't sustaining themselves. We see the same thing with Cliff. This one broke up. We actually had the positive movement there, but you still haven't gotten green above red, even at the depressed level here. So that's going to have to start turning around. Still more positive than negative at this particular point, but any tilt up of cyan is not going to be hard to take out. This peak was at 2.57 is the reading, and you're at 0.4, so just a pivot up, and that would change everything for it. But be watching. Needs to get that green above this -7.5 to clear out the previous range here, and you want to keep seeing red breaking away from the white, getting a nice spread. That usually is where you get your best price action. Intraday, you can see it cross over a little bit of the breakdown. Is divergent to an upside from the pivot. You just don't have a third one even to accentuate that positive extreme, so you expected the retrace of the low. I think that was something we also noticed on WLT we'll look at in a second from the 78-minute. We'd liked AIG continue to, so a little bit of a steel down pivot on that move, but big rise in green, big rise in red. The cyan is well below. Yes, we've got positive extremes. So as soon as we get the pivot up of cyan, yeah, then we'll want to sell in the money call setup or just take your gains and wait for a retest to sell another put. Here was the WLT. We talked about that it was going to retrace the low of this bar right here, which was what, 676. So I said sell your calls deep or take your gains, and sure enough did exactly as expected. Nice and easy when it does it like that. And from our 50K standpoint, you can see that it's already changing its stops. 1892. Where's this one at right now? Performance report. There we go. Current trade. Yeah, it's pretty decent so far. This should put it back up into new high range. Now, obviously, for those that are wondering, in our settings values, you can go in there and you want to make sure they match. This chart should be identical to the one that's provided on the workspace that comes with everything, and it goes through all the various readings and settings that you have to have in there to get the same setup that you're seeing right here. But overall, it's doing fine, and we knew that there were several of these areas that we didn't have to get involved in some of these traps. At least could have even taken further gains on those, and that's why we go over them periodically. Take a look at intraday real quick. Here's the 5K intraday, and we can see that from the continuation of the green, got a little bit of a short signal. Weren't expecting a whole lot because that steel had still stayed quite a ways below, and sure enough, came down, put in a new buy very early on, pivoted, retraced it again. We expected those lows from this deep red here to get retraced at some point. It shot up nicely and then retraced right exactly to those. And then we put it in again and it traded sideways, retested those lows before putting in the nice buy. And you can see the difference between where the red was here. We had the dip below. Pop was very minimal. Normally you expect that pop to be a little bit stronger than that, so that was definitely weaker. The interesting part about that, though, despite the fact that it was weaker, when we retested the lows, there was no real break of the setup, so they're just really, and this is kind of a testing period. Oh, let me see that the screen is a little bit big here. Let me adjust that down a little bit. There. That makes more sense. Yeah. Sorry about that. There we go. It makes it a little bit easier to visualize. Needless to say, you're still kind of in a muck, and it's interesting because it got not oversold, but it certainly wasn't overbought where you're seeing the red well above zero or anything like that. And the key one right here would be if this red pivots lower, below the zero at this particular point, then I would expect a bit more selling into the setup than we've seen previously. So that's worth noting. Not a surprise that the 50K also set a higher stop. So keep that in mind. We'll take a look at a couple of the alert stocks. Here we have Apple. Nice with the green, still on the rise. That's why we weren't worried about. I don't know what that one's popping up for. Amazon, that's still not incredibly great. Yes, you had the nice power of the steel moving above. We are in the deep red here. I would expect that any pivot lower in this particular case, or a steel pivot lower, is going to result in some give back on that. Would not be too thrilled with that one. Google, yeah, that's pretty decent from that standpoint, in the sense that the difference being is you have that big green crossover, a nice clearing of the red, moving into a new zone. So, it's subtle, but clearly distinct. Here we have Netflix, and Netflix can't get above there, even though you have a nice spread, red, white. That's what's keeping it moving. Formed 3 lower peaks, so potentially that could be in the divergence, but definitely going to have to watch the steel in this case to see if it dips below cyan. I would see if cyan takes a move to the upside, that would be the time to sell or buy puts in that case. You'd have to sell deep in the money calls for that setup. PCLN. Yeah, that's Spread's still maintaining itself. You're going to have to get green all the way above that negative 7.5. So this is not looking terrific. And you obviously have dip below the red line, which would suggest a retrace all the way to the lows when the time comes. That was the previous low. So now we would expect a move that will take you all the way back down to that 1090 range on any kind of steel dip or that, any fading of bulls jumping in. Tesla, nice little pop there. We had the break above, and that's usually a good momentum when you get this steel pops above the cyan. It was just a matter of looking for the beginnings of the green popping. Still a long way, and it's still terribly bearish overall, given that spread. Speaking of which, everyone says that the bottom is in Twitter, and I was warning you, no, we were seeing the deep red there. Still can't get green over the red white, and that red's going to roll over very shortly here and steal all the way up in this no spark area here. Not looking good for that. So it's weird, despite market highs, there's some stuff that's got some weakness built into it. Baidu, likewise, can't get that green over, and it's still a pretty reasonable spread. I mean, when you're not getting the cyan dipping, strongly below 0 when you get these nice up moves, this is a pretty telling signal to you. And likewise, here we go. FAS has been doing really good. I mean, you had the cyan all the way below 0, so that's been positive all along. And that green maintaining and the nice spread between red and white, so that's been good. So financials just been a little bit divergent to the rest of the readings. Go figure. Facebook, we'll look at that one real quick too. And yeah, it's got the potential. It's just a little bit slow. You need to really see that percolate over, otherwise you got a problem, because again, you got to clear that negative 7.5 here on the green, and steel pivot lower at this particular point is going to be a lower pivot, so be cautious on that one. We look at WLT on daily. We didn't look at that in daily. It's always had this huge spread, but look at it, finally, even though it produced this in the red, finally had narrowed the spread a little bit, but then boom, next day. So again, and no spark from that setup right there. Not going anywhere. As always, though, continue to look for me on private Twitter feed, StockTwits, and we will talk again tomorrow. Trade well.